Thank you, Shane, and I am thrilled to be invited by the Chittenden County Republicans to honor a great man in American history and a great man in my life, Ronald Reagan, on the year when I'm sure many of us wish we had him back. Let me just take a few minutes to explain how somebody from first Illinois and then northeastern Vermont ended up in the Reagan camp. The old-timers may remember in 1964, movie star Ronald Reagan gave a talk on national television from Los Angeles called A Time for Choosing. How many of you ever remember seeing that talk? Without giving away your age, of course, because it's on YouTube. And I recommend you see it on YouTube. Reagan had for years been a spokesman for General Electric, going around plant to plant, giving speeches about free enterprise and the American dream, and so on, and was widely considered to have been washed up as a movie actor. He was never a top-flight star. He was always the best friend of the top-flight star. And by 1964, he was not a big factor in Hollywood, but that speech put him on the map, and I remember watching it in Michigan, where I was working in a campaign. I turned around and said to the person I was with, "There goes the next governor of California." And of course, I was absolutely right. 2 years later, he ran for governor and was elected in the first of 2 terms by a very strong margin in a state which, as we know, has been for many years a Democratic state, at least has been now. So that's how I first got wind of Ronald Reagan as a political figure. And in 1973 or 4, his last year as governor, through a friend of mine, I made the acquaintance of Peter Hannaford. Peter was Reagan's press secretary, but more than that. He was his idea man and sort of his alter ego. Pete died a month or 2 ago at 82 in Northern California. A wonderful, gentle, bright, creative individual that I loved to work with. Well, I wrote a speech, a piece of a housing speech, and I was doing housing work at that time, that Reagan used in the California setting. And then his term as governor concluded in 1974. And he and Pete Hannaford and Mike Deaver, another Reagan worker in the State House in Sacramento, set up a firm called Deaver and Hannaford and became the public relations marketing arm of Ronald Reagan Enterprises, if you will. One of his leading enterprises was a 4-minute radio show, which I suppose many of you have heard sometime in the past. It was on 380-some stations around the country, and many of the radio scripts turned into newspaper columns that were syndicated and run in maybe 200 more newspapers. So he was a well-known commentator and a well-known speaker after he left the governorship. And Pete Hannaford said to me, every day we got to have another, 5 days a week we have to have a radio speech. The governor writes a great many of them himself. And in fact, those have now been collected in a book by my one-time boss in the White House, Martin Anderson, called Reagan in His Own Hand. These are the radio scripts that he wrote personally that were rescued from a cardboard box full of handwritten yellow pad sheets. Somehow, when he left the governorship, they'd been pushed aside into an archive, and nobody really knew what they were until Kyron Skinner at Hoover Institution somehow discovered them and sorted them out, pieced them all together, and showed that, contrary to what many of the liberal Democrats said about Reagan, just a pretty boy from Hollywood, no real depth. You can read this book and see that Reagan had really serious policy depth. He thought a lot about issues, he thought a lot about principles, he thought a lot about values. And the manuscripts that he wrote and delivered reflected that. However, Pete needed more scripts. He wrote many himself. I wrote 46, as it turned out. And I'm proud to say that scarcely was a word ever changed by either Pete or by Governor Reagan. of the scripts that I wrote. I'm sort of thrilled to hear them on WSTJ in St. Johnsbury, brought to you by Vib Motors. I hear the governor saying the words that I had written from my house up in Paradise of Kirby. Well, that's how I got into the Reagan apparatus, although I never met him at this point in person. Well, he lost the 1976 challenge to Jerry Ford, and was widely considered to be finished as a politician. He was 65 years old at the time. And he went back to write radio and newspaper commentaries. And many of the 46 that I wrote came between the end of the 76 challenge and 79 when he announced his candidacy, much to the surprise of many, for another run at the White House. During that time, in the late, I guess 79 or so, I met him for the first time, but we had corresponded some back and forth because I'm writing his stuff. And as a one-time research director in campaigns, it was my job to make sure that my candidate didn't make some glaring factual error that got him crucified politically. So Reagan had a couple of very well-loved by him quotations that he used on his 4x6 cards from which he spoke. He had a whole fistful of cards that he would, if he spoke in Flint, Michigan, as we did once, he put stuff in there about Buick and the importance of Flint to America, and then he would, in the economic program, then he'd throw in cards to keep the audience's attention up, get a few laughs from the audience to show that he understood something about the location that he was speaking. Well, two of his favorite slogans were, and you probably have heard this, and if you remember him as president, the city on the hill. You remember that one? When the pilgrim John Winthrop stood on the deck of the little ship Arbella in Boston Harbor and said, "We shall build a city on the hill." That was his line. Well, actually, John Winthrop said that, but he wasn't a pilgrim. Pilgrims were 20 years earlier and 40 miles away. He was a Puritan, not a pilgrim. Secondly, his other famous quote was Thomas Paine, who in those dark days of Valley Forge, Thomas Paine roused Americans to the cause of freedom by saying, "We can build the world anew here in America." Well, actually, Thomas Paine said that in 1775, 3 years before any soldier ever set foot in Valley Forge. Well, I sort of swallowed hard, and I wasn't that personally close to him at this point. I said, well, do I just let this one go, or do I at least clue him in? So I bit the bullet here, and I sent him a letter with a memo saying, actually, it wasn't a pilgrim at all. I was a Puritan, a different time, different place. And it was 3 years earlier that Paine made those stirring words. And Reagan sent a note back, and he said, well, let's suppose it was a pilgrim with a small p. Or what about Thomas Paine? I said, well, maybe he said it again in 1778. Which I thought was pretty charitable of him. When I opened that letter, I was a little apprehensive about who the hell do you think you are response. But he was a gentlemanly, courteous, and sympathetic, and especially to those who were committed to the same values, and saw in him a voice for those values. I might tell you one other just a little story. If you remember, he co-starred with Errol Flynn in 2 or 3 movies. The one I remember was about an Air Force mission in occupied Germany or Norway, where some of the plane crashed, and Errol and Ron got out and had to fight their way back to the Allied lines. So he knew Errol Flynn quite well. About 1979 or 80, I can't remember just where we had this exchange, but there was a rumor going around that Errol Flynn was a closet Nazi. In fact, there was a movie later on that had a character that looked a lot like Errol Flynn, who was a closet Nazi. I can't remember where that movie was, but it arose from this rumor. I happen to like Errol Flynn. I thought Errol Flynn's Robin Hood was the greatest movie ever made. Right. And so I said to him, I know, Mr. President, you were, of course, co-star. Actually, he didn't co-star. He was the sub-star. But I was willing to bend the truth a little bit there. With Errol Flynn. you know, some people say out in Hollywood are saying that Errol Flynn was in his secret life was a sort of a closet Nazi. He turned around and looked at me and said, nobody would dare to say that if Errol was still alive. Which I thought conclusively settled that issue. And he was dead serious. Obviously, like Errol was a wild, swashbuckling guy on the screen, and also in his private life. As you might expect from a guy who was that handsome and dashing in the 1940s. But he settled that rumor in one quick, brief sentence. I'll tell you one more story that my wife wants me to tell us about Nancy. Rest her soul. Nancy had a peculiar habit on the campaign plane. I only went out in the campaign plane with them once. That was back to Illinois, and they laughed and said it took me along as an interpreter. Remember, there's more to this. Reagan grew up in Illinois, born in Dixon, Illinois, went to Eureka College. But Northern Illinois and Southern Illinois are like New Hampshire and South Carolina, linguistically. There's a reason for that, I won't go into all that. But the Southern Illinois accent is Ohio Valley, Wabash Valley, Arkansas, West Virginia. And the Northern Illinois accent is Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New England. So that's why they said that somebody laughed and said, we're taking along as an interpreter. So we're on the plane, and the president, or the candidate, and Mrs. Reagan are in the little front compartment, and the flunkies are all in the next compartment, and then the lowest platform of life, the media, are in the back compartment. And we always disliked the media because every time there's a buffet laid out on the plane, the media rushed the shrimp first. And we had to endure the deprivation while those people back there got the wrong expense accounts, got all the goodies. Well, Mrs. Reagan's particular thing was when the plane tipped up from nose up on the takeoff, she'd take an orange, stand up at the front of the plane, high heels, leaning forward, and see if she could roll the orange all the way back to the end of the 737, 727. For some reason, this is here's a Secret Service guy on each side, and they don't want to be the guy to let Mrs. Reagan land on her face on an airplane, and they're all really uptight. Mr. President, the candidate, Ron, was busy at the table doing things with other people, Chuck Percy, actually, who was the senator I worked for before. So here she rolls this orange all the way back. Well, I knew she was going to do this. So while we're still on the tarmac and hadn't taken off, we just come back from Southern Illinois. And anybody here know what a hedge apple is? Okay, one person out of this crowd, Agnes?
I grew up in Southern Indiana.
Bingo. Okay, a hedge apple is a thing the size of a large orange that grows on an Osage orange tree, which is a scraggly tree that forms windbreaks out on the farms in the Midwest. And when it first drops off the tree, it's like a rock. And later on, it rots and gets soft and it's great for fights. When I was down in Butler, Illinois, while he's giving his farm talk, there's a whole row of Osage orange trees. So I happened to notice a couple on the ground, so I scooped them up and put them in my sack to take back because my office mate in the Reagan headquarters was Jim Brady of Centralia, Illinois. Our bitter rivals in basketball. And so Brady and I are always making up derogatory stories about each other's hometown. He wasn't there very much, he was on the plane most of the time. So I figured, all right, Brady knows what a hedge apple is, and when it gets nice and ripe, he's going to find it in his desk drawer. So I had him in my sack. And so I think when I went up to the front desk where Mrs. Reagan and the governor were sitting, I said to Mrs. Reagan, since you're out here in Southern Illinois, Mrs. Reagan, maybe you want to try rolling this down the length of the plane instead of the orange. Say it happened for Florida. And she looked at it like it was carried the Black Plague. And had me set it on the table and sort of recoiled from it. All right, I went back and sat down. Sure enough, pretty soon she gets up and takes the orange and tries to roll it down the length of the plane unsuccessfully. Well, the plane lands and we're getting off the front exit. And I go by the table where she's gone. Governor Reagan is sitting there with a couple of people. And there's their hedge apple in the middle of the table. And I said, Governor, you know what that is, don't you? He says, sure, it's a hedge apple. So I thought it validated my experience as a guide and interpreter downstate Illinois. Well, once in the White House, I didn't spend much time with the president. The White House is heavily structured. The president sees what staff members the chief of staff thinks he needs to see when he needs to see them. And you don't just drop in and chat, right? And I could walk up to the door of the Oval Office and see what's going on in there as long as there's nobody in there. I only went in there once, actually, and this is the day I left. And the White House photographer was very good. I came in, I didn't ask even. He just sent in to take that picture of me shaking hands with the president for the last time. Well, I have about 2 more hours of stories like that, but out of deference to your schedule tonight, I just want to finish by saying one thing about Ronald Reagan that I wrote when he died in 2004, an excerpt. Coming into office when this country's morale was at a depressing low point, his sunny optimism, his belief in freedom and opportunity, his courageous leadership, his simple but strong faith in his God and his country, revived America's flagging spirits and gave new purpose to its role in the world. His policy set off an 8-year boom that took America's economic strength to new heights and brought increased prosperity to rich and poor alike. Thanks to his courageous leadership, coupled with that of Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, John Paul II, and hundreds of Polish shipyard workers, the world's leading Marxist-Leninist regime collapsed into the ash heap of history without a shot fired. When he died in 2004, the last leader of that evil empire came to the National Cathedral to pay his respects to the great liberator. Ronald Reagan believed in freedom for every person everywhere. Freedom to work at the calling of one's choice, freedom to enjoy the fruits of one's labors, freedom to own and control one's property, and the freedom to participate in a free market. He believed in restraining the heavy hand of government in the lives of our people, because as he often said, as government grows, liberty shrinks. In a memorable address to students at Moscow State University in 1988, he said, freedom is the recognition that no single person, no single authority or government has a monopoly on the truth, that every individual life is infinitely precious, every one of us put on this earth has been put here for a reason and has something to offer. Because Americans know that liberty, just as life itself is not earned, but a gift from God, they seek to share that gift with the world. Reagan understood, like Adams, Jefferson, and Madison before him, the preservation of a free republic requires a widespread distribution of private property ownership. He understood, too, the menace of giantism and the importance of preserving the wellsprings of voluntary action at a human scale. A small business, fraternal lodge, congregation, block club, town council, a scale that nurtures standards of right behavior, prevailing ethic of what is right and what is wrong. In the 1978 radio commentary, he observed that the issue is not one of left and right. The real issue is how to reverse the flow of power to ever more remote institutions and to restore that power to the individual, the family, and the local community. Alas, for reasons that are perhaps understandable, his administration did little to bring about any such decentralization of power. But probably more than any other president of this century, Ronald Reagan loved America and the American dream. When he bid farewell to the presidency, he spoke movingly of his favorite metaphor from Puritan leader John Winthrop. America is a shining city on the hill. How stands the city on this winter night? After 200 years, she still stands strong and true on the granite ridge. And her glow is held steady no matter what storm. She's still a beacon, still a magnet, for all who must have freedom, for all the pilgrims from the lost places who are hurtling through the darkness toward home. Ronald Reagan is the last passed from the dark shadow of his final years into the sunlight. That little corner of heaven reserved for those who spoke and acted to preserve liberty and advance the rights of mankind. Paraphrase what Reagan himself said once about Thomas Jefferson. His fellow Americans, and men and women everywhere in the world who yearn for the freedom to follow their own destinies, would do well to pluck a flower from Ronald Reagan's life and wear it in their soul forever.